What would you do if your faith was tested in the line of those who hated the Catholic faith? Previously on March Martyrs, we looked at a common martyr, Saint Joan of Arc. This week, we remember the woman who defied King Henry VIII. This is the story of a martyred Plantagenet. This is the story of Blessed Margaret Pole. Margaret was born at Fairlie Castle in Somerset as the only surviving daughter of George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, and his wife Isabel Neville, who was the eldest daughter of Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, and his wife Anne Beauchamp, the 16th Countess of Warwick. Her maternal grandfather was killed fighting against her uncle, King Edward IV, at the Battle of Barnet. Her father, already Duke of Clarence, was then created the Earl of Salisbury and of Warwick. Edward IV declared that Margaret's younger brother Edward should be known as the Earl of Warwick, as a courtesy title, but no peerage was ever created for him. Margaret would have had a claim to the Earldom of Warwick, but the earldom was forfeited on the attainder of her brother Edward. Margaret's mother died when she was 3. Her father had 2 servants killed when they thought they had poisoned her. The Duke of Clarence plotted against Edward IV, and in February of 1478, he was attainted and executed for treason. The lands and titles were thereby forfeited. Edward IV died peacefully in 1483 when Margaret was 10. The next year, the late king's marriage was declared invalid by the Statutitius Regis of 1484, making his children illegitimate. Since Margaret and her brother Edward were debarred from the throne by their father's attainder, their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was offered the crown and became king as Richard III. He married Anne Neville, a younger sister of Margaret's mother Isabel. Richard III sent the children to the Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. In 1485, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor, who succeeded him as King Henry VII. The new king married Margaret's cousin, Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, and Margaret and her brother were taken into their care. Soon young Edward, a potential York claimant to the throne, was moved to the Tower of London. Edward was briefly displayed in public at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1487 in response to the presentation of the impostor Lambert Simnel as the Earl of Warwick to the Irish lords. Shortly thereafter, somewhere possibly in November of 1487, Henry VII gave Margaret in marriage to his cousin, Sir Richard Pole, whose mother was a half-sister of the king's mother, Margaret Beaufort. When Perkin Warbeck impersonated Edward IV's presumed dead son, Richard of Shrewsbury, 1st Duke of York, in 1499, Margaret's brother Edward was attainted and executed for involvement in the plot. Richard Pole held a variety of offices in Henry VII's government, the highest of them being Chamberlain for Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's elder son. When Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, Margaret became one of her ladies-in-waiting, but her entourage was dissolved when Arthur died in 1502 at the age of 15. When her husband died in 1505, Margaret became a widow with 5 children. She had a small estate of land inherited from her husband, but no other income and no prospects. Henry VII paid for Richard's funeral. To ease the situation, Margaret devoted her third son, Reginald Pole, to the church. He was to have an eventful career as a papal legate, and later as Archbishop of Canterbury. Later in life, he bitterly resented her abandonment of him. After her husband's death, Margaret had such inadequate means to support herself and her children that she was forced to live at Sion Abbey as the guest of the Brigittine nuns. She remained there until she returned to favor when Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon in 1509, and Margaret was again appointed as one of her ladies-in-waiting. In 1512, an Act of Parliament restored to Margaret the earldom of Salisbury and some of her brother's lands which had belonged to it, for which she paid 5,000 marks, which is equivalent in the British standards as of 2021, £2,164,602. Henry VII had controlled them first while her brother was a minor, and then during his imprisonment, he later confiscated them after his trial. However, her brother Warwick's and Spencer estates remained in the hands of the crown. As Countess of Salisbury, Margaret managed her lands well, and by 1538 she was the 5th richest peer in England. She was a patron of the new learning. Like many Renaissance noblewomen, Gentian Hervet had translated Aramis's De Immensa Misericordia Dei, better known as The Great Mercy of God, into English for her. Her first son, Henry Pole, was created Baron Montagu, another of the Neville titles. Speaking for the family of the House of Lords, her second son, Arthur Pole, had a generally successful career as a courtier and becoming one of the 6 gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. Arthur Pole suffered a setback when his patron, Edward Stafford, the 3rd Duke of Buckingham, was convicted of treason in 1521, but was soon restored to favor. He died young, in roughly 1526, having married the heir of Roger Lucknow. Margaret and her son Henry pressed Arthur's widow to a vow of perpetual chastity to preserve her inheritance for her Pole children. Her daughter Ursula married the Duke of Buckingham's son, Henry Stafford, but after the Duke's fall, the couple were given only fragments of the estates. Margaret's third son, Reginald, studied abroad in Padua, Italy. He was Dean of Exeter and Wimborne Minster, Dorset, as well as a canon of York. He had several other livings, although he had not been ordained a priest. In 1529, he represented Henry VIII in Paris, persuading the theologians of the Sorbonne to support Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Her youngest son, Geoffrey Pole, married to Constance, daughter of Edmund Pakenham, and inherited the estate of Lordington in Sussex. Margaret's own favor at court varied. She had a dispute over land with Henry VIII in 1518. He awarded the contested lands to the Dukedom of Somerset, which had been held by his Beaufort great-grandfather, and were now in possession of the crown. In 1520, Margaret was appointed governess to Henry's daughter Mary. The next year, her sons were mixed up with Buckingham. She was removed from that appointment, but later restored to it by 1525. When Mary was declared a bastard in 1533, Margaret refused to give Mary's gold plate and jewels back to Henry. Mary's household was broken up at the end of the year, and Margaret asked to serve Mary at her own cost, but was not permitted. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis suggested 2 years later that Mary be handed over to Margaret, but Henry refused, calling her a fool of no experience. In 1531, Reginald Pole warned of the dangers of the Boleyn marriage. He returned to Padua in 1532 and received a last English benefice in December of that same year. Chapuis suggested to Emperor Charles V that Reginald marry Mary and combine their dynastic claims. Chapuis also communicated with Reginald through his brother Geoffrey. Reginald replied to the books Henry sent him in his own pamphlet, Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitas Deficione, or De Unitate, which denied Henry's position on the marriage of a brother's wife, denied royal supremacy. Reginald also urged the princes of Europe to dispose of Henry immediately. Henry wrote to Margaret, who in turn wrote to her son, reproving him for his folly. In May 1536, Reginald finally and definitively broke with the king. After Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, was arrested and executed, Margaret was permitted to return to court, albeit briefly. In 1537, Reginald, who still was not ordained, was made a cardinal. Pope Paul III put him in charge of organizing assistance for the Pilgrimage of Grace and related movements. The pilgrimage was an effort to organize a march on London to install a conservative Catholic government, instead of Henry's increasingly Protestant-leaning one. Neither Francis I of France nor the Emperor supported this effort, and the English government tried to have Reginald assassinated. In 1539, Reginald was sent to the Emperor to organize an embargo against England, the sort of countermeasure he had himself warned Henry was possible. As part of the investigations into the so-called Exeter conspiracy, Geoffrey Pole was arrested in August of 1538. Gregory had been corresponding with Reginald. The investigation of Henry Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, who was Henry VIII's first cousin and Geoffrey's second cousin, had turned up his name. Geoffrey appealed to Thomas Cromwell, who had him arrested and interrogated. Under interrogation, Geoffrey said that his eldest brother, Lord Montagu, and the Marquess had been parties to his correspondence with Reginald. Montagu, Exeter, and Margaret were arrested in November of 1538. In January 1539, Geoffrey was pardoned, but Margaret's son, Henry, Baron Montagu, and cousin Exeter was later executed for treason after the trial. In May 1539, Henry, Margaret, Exeter, and others were retained, as Margaret's father had been. The conviction meant they lost their titles and their lands, mostly in the south of England, conveniently located to assist any invasion. As part of the evidence for the Bill of Attainder, Cromwell produced a tunic bearing the 5 wounds of Christ, symbolizing Margaret's support for the Church of Rome, the rule of her son Reginald, and the king's Roman Catholic daughter Mary. The supposed discovery 6 months after her house and effects were searched at the arrest is likely to have been a fabrication. She was sentenced to be executed at the king's will. She was sentenced to death to be executed at the king's will. Margaret Pole, as she is now styled, was held in the Tower of London for 2.5 years. She, her grandson Henry, son of her own son Henry, and Exeter's son, were held together and supported by the king. She was attended by servants and received an extensive grant of clothing in March 1541. In 1540, Cromwell fell from favor and was attainted and executed. This following poem was found carved on the wall in her cell. For traitors on the block should die. I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards the block I shall not go, nor make one step, as you shall see. Christ, in thy mercy, save thou me. On the morning of May 28th, 1541, Margaret was told she was to die within the hour. She answered that no crime had been imputed to her. Nevertheless, she was taken from her cell to the place within the precincts of the Tower of London, where a low wooden block had been prepared instead of the customary scaffold. 2 written eyewitnesses reports survived her execution, one by Marillac, the French ambassador, and the other by Chapuis, ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor. The accounts differ slightly. Marillac's report, dispatched 2 days afterwards, recorded that the execution took place in a corner of the tower with so few people present that, in the evening, news of her execution was doubted. Chapuis wrote 2 weeks after the execution that 150 witnesses were present for the execution, including the Lord Mayor of London. Chapuis wrote that, at first, when the sentence of death was made known to her, she found the thing very strange, not knowing what crime she was accused, nor how she had been sentenced. Because the main executioner had been sent north to deal with rebels, the execution was performed by a wretched and blundering youth who literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. A third account in Burke's Peerage, possibly apocryphal, described the appalling circumstances of the executions. It stated that Margaret refused to lay her head on the block, declaiming, "So should traitors do, and I am none." According to that account, she turned her head every which way, instructing that the executioner that if he wanted her head, he should take it as he could. Margaret was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. Her remains were later uncovered when the chapel was renovated in 1876. On December 29, 1886, Pope Leo XIII, writer of the Prayer to St. Michael, beatified her. And later, her son Reginald, the last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, said that he, quote, would never fear to call himself the son of a martyr.